And we'll be reading from verses 8 to 20. Acts chapter 14, verses 8 to 20. Acts chapter 14, verses 8 to 20. Let's listen carefully to the reading of God's Word. And in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up, straight on your feet." And he leaped and walked. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran in among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in the bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witnesses, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, they could scarcely retain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. Then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. Thus far, the reading of God's Word. As we consider the passage that we just read today, and it is a harrowing experience or an account that Paul and Barnabas literally and personally lived through. And if we could have been eyewitnesses, or if we could have been one of those maybe flies on the wall that were there to watch and see exactly what happened in Lystra and Iconium, it would be extraordinary. And I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Noah. I don't know if it's out yet. Anyone seen the movie Noah, the new one with what's his name? No? Okay. Well, Russell Crowe, whoever that guy is. Anyways, how do you know that guy's name? Okay. All right. And anyways, there's this great big movie called Noah, and supposedly in the advertising, the account that I heard in the advertisements, they make it very clear that it is certainly based on the biblical account of Noah. However, even in the accounts of, even in the commercial, they make it very clear that it's loosely based on the account in the book of Genesis. And so we don't know exactly, and I'm sure since none of us saw the movie, we don't know exactly what the movie intends and what the point or the purpose of the movie is. But we can see that just in the commercials and the clips and the previews, that certainly they've added a lot more than what is included in the Bible account of the story of Noah. And so, if someone were to make a movie out of the life of the Apostle Paul, I'm sure they can dramatize and they can really make it sound a lot more than what it is. But in fact, when you read the account of the life of Paul, as well as the other apostles and the disciples, some of the stuff, it's very hard to make up. I mean, some of these things, it's even more outlandish. It's even more, it doesn't make sense. Even if you were to write it or consider this as fiction, it just doesn't make sense. And it's just simply way out of the normal realm of experience or human experience. And so we see that even, we see that in the account that we read today, because in the particular passage we read, we have, last week we talked We learn about the Apostle Paul and Barnabas and preaching in the city of Antioch, in the synagogues there, and then the Jewish people that heard. There were very many of them who believed, but then there were a lot of others who did not believe, and they wanted to persecute the Apostle Paul. And so they were going to, plan on getting him, entrapping him, and arresting him, and actually killing him. But they heard the news, and so they escaped. In Iconium, at the very beginning of chapter 14, they actually escaped to the city of Iconium, and what happens in Iconium is essentially the same thing. They go and they preach the Word of God, and they share the message of Jesus Christ. And the Bible, the book of Acts, tells us there were multitudes of Jews and Greeks who believed the Apostle Paul. But then again, there were still others who did not believe what the Apostle Paul said. And especially in particular, the Jews that did not believe, it tells us that the Jews who did not believe, they were so angered by the message of the Apostle Paul that they wanted to go and still do harm to the Apostle Paul as well as Barnabas. And so they move on to a city called Lystra, and it is there they have this encounter. And let me just kind of give you the setting. And so here's Paul and Barnabas and going into this city called Lystra. And Lystra was a very popular city, similar to Antioch. It was one of the trade cities, and so it was kind of a hub. And it was a city that connected many other cities in the ancient trade routes. And so there were many people there, as Jews as well as Greeks. And when the Apostle Paul went in and started to share the Word of God like he did in the other cities that he went, he was able to draw a lot of attention. And on this particular time, he goes and he sees a crippled man. And Luke here, he adds the specifics about, this crippled man had never walked. He was born this way. And so he had never walked a moment, never a single step in his whole life. However, when Paul saw this man, and the Bible gives us a very specific account, it says, Paul observing him intently. And so Paul, out of the crowd, saw this man standing out for some reason. I'm sure God's providence and God's will had a part in it. And so this man who was sitting amongst the crowd, all of a sudden pops up into Paul's vision and he begins to look intently at this person. And so if you were to kind of dramatize it, you might have a screenshot of multitudes of people just kind of hustle and bustle. People are just going this way and that way. And all of a sudden the camera shot focuses in on a single person maybe and zooms in and then begins to focus on this one particular person. And so Paul's attention is focused on this crippled man. And he says he looked at him intently, and seeing that he had faith to be healed, here's what Paul says. He said in a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." And what happens? This crippled man who had never ever walked a day in his life, he leaps up and he begins to walk. Now, there's a similar story to this in the earlier chapters of the book of Acts. And, it's a very similar situation. However, the crowd responds very differently. Back in chapter 3, when the crippled beggar is healed by Peter, and, he stands up and he's leaping and jumping for joy, we have people that are totally responding in a different way than the crowd here responds. And so instead of just people being amazed at what they had seen, all of a sudden, the way that the people respond gives us a clue, a very clear clue, or an indication of where that city of Lystra was in terms of their religious life. And so, instead of people just kind of being skeptical, instead of people just being amazed and maybe responding to this miracle as some sort of a magic trick or anything like that, the people respond in a very distinctly religious, with religious overtones. And so when people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And all of a sudden, the people, the crowd, started calling Barnabas and Paul by Greek gods' names. So they called Barnabas Zeus, and they called Paul Hermes. And this is an indication as to how entrenched and how overwhelmingly this idea of these Greek mythological gods had a place in the Lystrian society. And so in their mind frame, in their way of looking at the world and interpreting the world, I'm sure they were all busy, just like you guys, just like us. You know, during the weekdays, we're busy walking around, doing our thing, doing our jobs, and getting our, kids ready, or getting ourselves ready for work, or trying to get things done. And all of a sudden, if you were encountered with some sort of an oddball kind of a situation, and I know many of us had a similar, all of us had an encounter like that this week. On Friday, I'm sure all of you, around 9 o'clock, a little after 9, all of you felt the earthquake, right? And so when we feel the earthquake, I know how it was in our house. I think we were somewhere, we were just kind of scattered in our house. I think Connor, me, and my wife were in the garage, and we were doing the laundry, and then the things start shaking, and then we all start to rush in, and we forgot Connor was in the garage, and so we had to go back out and get Connor and bring him back into the garage, and then kids were, wondering what they needed to do. We had our oldest, Kara, who was just kind of freaked out by it, started to cry, even didn't know what to do. And then we had Kirsten, who was just like, scattered, running around, wondering what was going on, getting just freaked out. Because it is one of those circumstances and situations where people are absolutely helpless to do anything. I mean, the only thing we can do is just either write it out or respond in all sorts of various ways, depending on our past experiences or knowledge about, how people ought to react in an earthquake. And then I know some of the aftershocks that we felt, we had everybody go under our kitchen table. And so the second time around, we kind of knew what to do. And kids were able to kind of do that, go under something. But when something like that hits us just out of nowhere, when we're not expecting it, it's our innermost innate kind of a response, a gut response. And I'm sure, I don't know, maybe if you have a funny or an interesting story you can share with us after worship, but, we react and respond with our guts in a very intense and unexpected moment like that. Now, when this unexpected event happened with this crippled man, and Paul, with his words, simply commanded that this man stand up, and he leaped up and he walked, the crowds that had started to gather, their response wasn't, all over the place. The city, when we look at some accounts, historical accounts, the city of Lystra, it says, they were temples that were dedicated to Zeus all over the place. Just like, maybe we would see churches as we drive through our cities. We see many, many churches. Nowadays, we see a lot of different other, religious buildings as well. We see mosques, we see SDA churches, we see Mormon churches, and we see a lot of other religious buildings just, driving about. And back in those days, the temple to Zeus, or temples to Zeus, would have been very, very commonplace. And the people's identification of who they were, the citizens of Lystra, I mean, they were, whatever, they may have held different citizenship statuses. However, they identified very commonly with Zeus. To them, Zeus was their god. To them, this Hermes was the, in Greek mythology, Hermes was the son of Zeus. And so Hermes had this responsibility of sharing or proclaiming or sending out messages or carrying messages. And so in that context, in that city of Lystra, they responded by saying these two, after seeing what they had done, these two totally misinterpreted the intent and the purpose of what Paul was able to do, in that particular situation. And so they attributed that healing to Zeus and Hermes. And all of a sudden they started calling Barnabas Zeus and started calling Paul Hermes. Now, what could have happened? You know, there are a couple things. I mean, Barnabas and Paul, at that point, if they were just totally in it for just purely selfish and just, you know, wanting to kind of profit from their circumstances, certainly they could have played along. I mean, the priest at the temple of Zeus came out upon hearing this, you know, healing. He came out, he brought an ox, he brought all these garlands to the gates, so that he was already getting ready for a massive, massive sacrifice to Zeus. And there was a legend, you know, that would pass down from generations to generations in the city of Lystra that you know, some time ago, many, many years ago, generations ago, Zeus and Hermes came down. They went around the city knocking on doors to see who would be hospitable, and they visited 1,000 homes, and no one was hospitable to them except this elderly woman who ultimately was hospitable. And so Zeus and Hermes, the story goes, is that, you know, this lady's shack was turned into a great mansion and, you know, whatever like that. And so that legend had been passed down throughout generations. And so the people in Lystra, you know, they were aware. You know, that was one of those folk tales, one of those traditions that would have been passed down to the people that were alive at that time. And so to them, and in their experience, and in their surroundings, and in their environment, what they saw Paul do to this crippled beggar or crippled man was the only way that they could interpret it. Because that was their worldview. That was their experience. That was what they were taught, and that was what they knew. And so that was the only way that they could interpret what they saw Paul do. And they really thought that Barnabas and Paul were the gods, Zeus and Hermes. And like I said, the priest at the temple of Zeus, you know, he comes down and getting ready to do a big, massive sacrifice. And as this was building up in the crowd in the city, Paul and Barnabas, upon hearing this, what is their response? Instead of basking in the popularity, instead of ultimately maybe, you know, considering that this could be a profitable moment for them, Paul and Barnabas' response is very, very different and unexpected. And so, I mean, the story turns very quickly here. So here they are, Paul and Barnabas, all of a sudden they're looked upon as gods, and then they have to make sure that they correct that misnomer and misconception. And so they go down on their knees and in their bodies, and they tore off their clothes, and then Paul begins to explain that they are just like them. That Paul and Barnabas are men just like these people that are standing before them. And then the Apostle Paul begins to share with them the message of God's work throughout history. You know, very quick. You know, from the very beginning, the Apostle Paul establishes the fact that God is the creator of all things, creator of the heavens and the earth, the creator and the sustainer of all human life. And then ultimately what the Apostle Paul says is that even though back in the ages he let the nations just kind of do whatever they wanted, it wasn't like even back then God just simply left them alone to be just, you know, to be rotting away in their sins. Because the Apostle Paul makes it clear, even then, in verse 17, nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness. And so the Apostle Paul claims that even though that these nations and these people may not have heard the name of Jesus specifically, the Apostle Paul says God gave them plenty of opportunities to realize and understand that there was a creator. There was a God that is greater than Zeus or Hermes or any other god that they may have created for themselves. And he says he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, they could scarcely restrain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. So even after the Apostle Paul tells the people, look, we are not Zeus and we are not Hermes, they continued. They wanted to continue to sacrifice to what they thought, or who they thought was Zeus and Hermes. So here's Paul and Barnabas, experiencing this great popularity to a point where they become deified, as Zeus and Hermes. And then in verse 19, right away, we have a quick turn of events. It says, "Then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there." Now, where did these Jews come from? These Jews had chased after Paul and Barnabas from Antioch through Iconium, and they started probably when the Jews from Antioch went over to Iconium looking for Paul and Barnabas, they realized that they weren't there and they had taken off already. So they gathered probably more people that were opposed to Paul and Barnabas, and so they gathered a bigger crowd and they started chasing after Paul and Barnabas, finally catching up to them in Lystra. And so here they are. I mean, think about how chaotic that is. And think about how, unplanned and how just scattered and, really it seemed like there was no purpose and there was no big plan in the way that Paul and Barnabas carried out the message. Here they are, they're escaping people that are wanting to stone them and kill them. They're finally making it to these cities, and they're having success with certain groups of people, and then with another group of people they're not. And they're really confronting these people that are becoming militaristic. They're becoming not just opponents of what the message that Paul and Barnabas brought, but they are becoming angry to a point where they're going to take a crowd and wanting to really hurt Paul and Barnabas, really to a point where they want to kill them. And so here in verse 19 it says, "Then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead." Now what happened? Here was Paul and Barnabas. Heals this crippled man. And the city in Lystra, the people are basically proclaiming that Paul and Barnabas are Zeus and Hermes, they're gods, and they're sacrificing to them. And then all of a sudden you have another group of people that are dashing into the scene, and they are the ones that were chasing after Paul and Barnabas from Antioch and Iconium, and they're rousing up the multitudes, rousing up the crowd. And they're probably going back and forth, arguments back and forth. Someone saying, well, these are Zeus and Hermes. And then these groups, the Jews that had chased after Paul and Barnabas saying, no, these guys are imposters. This is what they did back there, and this is what they did in Iconium. And they're just causing, they're rabble-rousers. They're just troublemakers that are going through city after city causing, havoc. And so after a little while, the multitudes all of a sudden turn on Paul and Barnabas. And they're able to take Paul and they're able to drag him out to the city gates and basically stone Paul. Now, I don't know about you, whether you've actually seen somebody getting stoned, or whether, even in movies, it's very difficult to imagine. But literally, that's exactly what it is. They put somebody in front of a wall and you have a crowd that's on the other side, and this is not a game. People just basically pick up what they can throw and they start throwing at this person. And so imagine Paul, being dragged out, getting stoned, and then the Bible tells us that people left after they realized, they assumed that Paul was dead. So, this is just a very, very action-filled account of what the Apostle Paul and Barnabas went through in a matter of, just days, months, going from city to city, and having an opportunity to share the gospel with these people. And you obviously had people that were responding in different ways. Some cities, you go to the same city, you have half the city that are agreeing with you and believing in your message, and then you have another half of the city that are opposed to you and don't believe what you're saying. And then you go to another city, they make you gods. And then you go to another city where they basically take you out to the city gates and stone you to, practically until you're dead. Now, what does this message or this passage, have to teach us, as Christians? Like I said, if somebody were to make a movie out of the life of the Apostle Paul and focus on his first missionary journey and the following missionary journeys, it would be a great action movie. It's just filled with action here and there and all over the place, with plot twists here and there where they're all of a sudden, high in their, position, and all of a sudden they're brought way down to a point where they're basically struggling to stay alive physically. And I don't know about you, where your Christian life has led you. And I certainly hope, and I certainly don't pray that your life would be filled with ups and downs like the life of the Apostle Paul. But I think there are many things that we can learn. And one of the things that we can learn from this passage that we read today, through the experience of Paul and Barnabas, and in particular the experience of the Apostle Paul, is that people will respond to the same gospel message in very different ways. And as a result of people responding to the same gospel truth in different ways, we as Christians, especially those of us who are sharing and living a life of witness to the world, we're going out there into the world and we're showing and telling and demonstrating to everyone, this is what a Christian ought to look like. Not necessarily bragging, but certainly going out there into the world and being certain and being assured of who we are as Christians, and being able to say, we are not perfect. We're no way near perfect. The only perfection, the only person that was perfect was the very Son of God. But this is the life of a Christian. And I'm sure you have had experiences where people will respond to you differently. Some people will look at you and say, that person, she thinks, she's a Christian and she's too good for us and she doesn't hang out with us and she doesn't go to certain places like we do. They just think that they're too good for us. And then you may have other people who may look at you and go, oh man, that person's just a hypocrite. Just the other day, she was here with us, hanging out, drinking or doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And there she goes on Sunday, or there he goes on Sunday, going to church and worshiping and thinking like they're, all holier than thou and stuff. And so, they're just a bunch of hypocrites. And then there are others who will look at us and respond in very different ways. There may be some who may be thinking, that person has something that is missing in my life. Or they may look at you and say, that person sounds very interesting, looks very interesting, and behaves in a very interesting and different manner. There's something about that person. No matter how others respond to our witness, whether it be verbal or through our life witness of the good news or the gospel, no matter how others respond to that, we need to have a consistent message going out the other way. And I think that's one of the most essential things that we learn from the account of the Apostle Paul and in the book of Acts. Because even though not just the Apostle Paul, but all the disciples and the other apostles who went out and shared the name of Christ and who went out and shared the good news, they all experienced different responses from different people. They went out and sometimes there were multitudes who converted and believed in the name of Jesus. And other times there were multitudes who were just opposed and wanted to kill them for saying the name of Jesus Christ. But in all circumstances, in all situations, and in all accounts, the apostles' reaction to these people, whether it be it was favorable or whether it be in opposition and hatred, the response was always consistent. And that response, that consistent response, that consistent, retort and rebuttal to whatever outsiders or non-Christians or non-believers may have to say to us is always, the Apostle Paul stood, the Apostle Barnabas, Peter, John, all the other disciples, they stood not with their own life. They stood not there, proclaiming themselves to be something. Look, the people in Lystra gave Paul and Barnabas an easy reason, an easy way out. They're saying, we're Zeus and we're Hermes, and you need to listen to us. And they could have used that and trying to rationalize that and say, maybe we can use this to our advantage. They didn't do that. They were very clear as to who they were. And in the way that the Apostle Paul responds, first by saying, look, why are you doing this to us? We are men. We are human beings. We are creatures created by God the Creator, just like you. There is no arrogance. There is no place for arrogance for a Christian if we are going to have an effective witness to non-Christians. Paul never gloated or became arrogant and big-headed because of his identity as a disciple and an apostle. And so the Apostle Paul knew right away, in order to dispel all of this stuff, that they encountered in the city of Lystra, he had to go very down, low level, the essential question he had to answer, and that is who we are as people and as human beings. And the Apostle Paul lays it out very, very clearly. He says, we also are men with the same nature as you. And that's the perspective that we all need to have. I don't know about you, I'm sure, when I recount my life, especially early on, maybe in my high school or even in my college years, being a Christian, there were many times when I felt that I was better somehow, that I had a better standing than some of my friends who did not go to church, or some of my friends who did go to church, but somewhere in my mind I put us in certain categories. There were those of us who were churchgoers, but we were very, very active, where we went to church and went to Sunday school, went to Wednesday Bible study, Friday Bible study, very involved in youth group. And then, you had the next group of people who just basically came on Sundays or maybe on special events. And then you had the next group of people who just basically came on Sundays. And then you had the next group of people who would come on Sundays but then ditch. Their parents, think that they're at church, but then they leave and they go do something else, and then they come back when church is over, and then they go home. There were clearly in my mind, I remember, there were categories of people at church. And then somehow, we feel like we're, okay, as long as I'm better than, the next group. Or as long as I'm better than, this group down here, I'm a level ahead. See, that's not the approach that the Apostle Paul had. The approach and the response that the Apostle Paul had to the people, whoever they were, whether they were Christian, non-Christian, was essentially coming from the same place. The Apostle Paul understood that he was just like them. And we need to understand, and we need to absolutely take this to heart, that we are just like those people that are non-Christian. We, even though we are here, we are just like those people that are not currently at church, that are not believers. In the essential, in the ultimate bottom line way, in the most meaningful way, we are just like them. The only difference between us and them is the grace and the love that God has given us through His Son, and what God has done over time, throughout history, to demonstrate to us that God is still concerned about His people. So that is the only difference between us and them. That we have been given this great opportunity called faith. And God has given us faith. Just like the Apostle Paul looked intently in the eyes and in the face of this crippled person that was sitting there and basically saw faith. He had faith to be healed. And that is what we have been given. We have been given this faith so that we may have salvation. And so our encouragement to each and every one of us as we go out, into the world once again, no matter what hits us, when some natural disasters like earthquakes and things like that, or maybe some other, miraculous or some extraordinary events happen, and we see others who are responding in all sorts of different ways, we need to be able to have an answer. Okay, why does an earthquake happen? Why do people get hurt? We need to have an answer for those people who are asking. Sometimes it's the little kids. Sometimes it's the little kids. My kids, I was kind of surprised at some of the things that came out of my kids' mouths. Some of the questions that they had about earthquakes. Because really for my kids, it was really their first time. At least they're conscious and aware of what an earthquake is. And so I think it's important for us to kind of have a ready-made answer for those people who may have questions about who we are as Christians. But in order for us to relate to everyone else, we need to relate to them at the very essential level. That we are men, we are God's creations just like them. And the only difference that we have, only difference that there exists between Christians and non-Christians is the fact that we have been given faith by our God and our Savior. And it is our job and it is our duty to share that message with those people who still have a yearning, who are still kind of lost as to where their true Creator is, or who their true Creator is. Let's pray.